The shock of setting foot in America, their faces pressed against the glass, eyes wide with disbelief, bathed in the glow of electric lights they thought had vanished from the face of the earth. That was the first image. A train slowing to a halt in the fading light of dusk. Texas soil trembling gently beneath its steel wheels. Inside the cars, 1,850 German POWs, veterans of Rommel's once feared Afrika Korps, were silent. No shouts, no whispers, only stunned stares. They were not in a cattle car this time. Gone were the dark, airless wooden wagons of Europe, those rolling coffins of war and humiliation. Instead, they arrived in Pullman coaches, cushioned, polished, and gliding across the American South like hotel rooms on rails. Some prisoners thought it was a trick, a temporary illusion to soften them before the real suffering began. Others dared not speak, afraid they would wake from a dream too absurd to believe. Through the windows, they saw something that contradicted every ounce of propaganda they had swallowed back in Germany. Electric lights. Not in big cities, not in propaganda films, but in the countryside. Farmhouses, driveways, lampposts, and street corners illuminated with a consistency and casualness that left their throats dry. One soldier, a former communications officer, muttered under his breath, "In Saxony, we black out entire towns for fear of bombers. Here, even barns glow like theaters." What kind of decadent, careless nation had such luxury to spare, especially during war? The German regime had painted America as soft, divided, and in decline. In Nazi leaflets, Americans were described as jazz-drunk mongrels with no discipline, no unity, no future. And yet, here was this land of light, pulsing with infrastructure, warmth, and eerie abundance. Could this really be that America? The first feeling wasn't fear or hatred. It was confusion, a deep, disorienting sense of internal rupture, as if the world they thought they understood had been replaced overnight. They had crossed the Atlantic expecting barbed wire, starvation, and perhaps vengeance. Instead, they were met with velvet seats, functioning toilets, and guards who did not shout. No forced marches, no barking dogs, no humiliation, only routine, silence, efficiency. They were enemy soldiers, but here it seemed even enemies were still treated like humans. They didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning of a far deeper shock, one that wouldn't strike their bodies but their beliefs, their very sense of reality. The true disorientation hadn't even begun. But the real moment of awe was waiting for them just around the corner when they stepped inside the dining hall. Bread, light, and the hunger of the soul. The train doors hissed open, and with hesitant steps, the German prisoners of war descended into a world that looked and smelled nothing like the one they had left behind. Under a halo of overhead lights, they were ushered not into barracks or makeshift tents, but into a wide, clean mess hall gleaming with stainless steel and polished tile. What awaited them inside was not punishment. It was a feast. White bread, real white bread, stacked in trays. Slices so soft they collapsed between fingers, unaccustomed to such luxury. Butter, the golden spread they hadn't seen in years, sat in neat curls beside dishes of preserved jam. Coffee, not the scorched barley imitation they had suffered through in the Wehrmacht, but deep, rich brewed coffee, poured hot into tin mugs. And meat, not scraps, not rations, but generous, seasoned, sizzling cuts of beef. For dessert, ice cream, served in bowls like some American fantasy. Cool, creamy, impossibly real. Some prisoners ate in silence, their hands trembling. Others wept quietly. Many simply stared. It was the finest meal I'd had since 1939. One POW would later write, "We were prepared for hunger and degradation. Instead, we were given calories and confusion." And then came the moment that left a permanent crack in their armor. American soldiers, casual, chatting, careless, tossed unfinished portions into the trash. Food, thrown away. To the Germans, raised in scarcity, starved by war, that act was as jarring as artillery fire. They thought of their mothers, boiling potato peels, of wives lining up for hours in freezing lines, of children back home who hadn't tasted butter in months. And here, in the enemy's land, food was abundant enough to waste. The guilt hit harder than any slap. Some POWs recoiled, eyes lowered, unable to swallow another bite. But it wasn't just the food. It was what the food represented. That night, many stood outside their barracks, looking across the small American town just beyond the camp fences. What they saw didn't make sense. Light, everywhere, from gas stations, churches, houses, even barns. The blackout world they had left behind seemed medieval in comparison. How could a nation so at war be so bright? That question lit a flicker in their minds, a flicker that would grow. The bread filled their stomachs. The lights filled them with doubt. And somewhere deep inside, something began to stir, a hunger of the soul. Not for more food, but for answers. Because if the enemy's bread was better than yours, and their lights brighter than yours, what else had you been wrong about? But the greatest shocks weren't felt in the stomach. They would strike the nervous system of ideology itself. Cranes, ships, and the collapse of technical pride. If food was the first shock and light the second, then machines were the blow that shattered the foundation. For the German prisoners, who had once marched under the banners of Nazi engineering superiority, what they witnessed at the ports of Oran and later Norfolk felt like stepping into a mechanical dream, or a nightmare that proved everything they thought they knew was wrong. At the docks, cranes moved like clockwork, not powered by shouting men and frantic labor, but by smooth electric systems, guided by operators who barely raised their voices. Containers, cargo, and crates moved in choreographed unison, a ballet of steel and precision. And then came the ships. Liberty ships, thousands of tons of steel assembled in days, not months. Their hulls bore the signature of modular construction, mass production on a scale the Germans had never imagined was possible. To a German engineering officer, used to craftsmanship, small batch production, and detailed precision, these ships were heresy, but they worked. Efficient, reliable, endless. One POW reportedly muttered, "We handcrafted our ships like art. They assemble theirs like toys, and they float just fine." Radar dishes turned silently in the distance. Trucks, conveyors, forklifts buzzed with quiet energy. There was no chaos, only systems. Systems that didn't need slogans or salutes to operate. Just electricity, coordination, and confidence. A group of POWs with engineering backgrounds, men who once built tanks, bombs, and engines for the Reich, stood speechless at the Norfolk Naval Base. They watched a fleet of ships being loaded faster than their own troops had ever managed in peacetime. And these were not cities, they were machines of war, functioning with civilian speed. If this is what a weak nation looks like, one POW later wrote, then what does strength mean anymore? The cracks began to widen. These were not moments of curiosity anymore. They were moments of existential threat, not from bombs, but from realization. These men had believed in German superiority as a law of nature. Now, they felt like relics. Their pride in precision had met something far more dangerous: scale. Their belief in discipline had been answered by flexibility, and their vision of a master race was being outperformed by ordinary dock workers in denim. "We were engineers of yesterday," one man confessed, "but here we saw tomorrow, and it did not speak German." As the cranes spun, the ships sailed, and the electricity flowed, a different kind of silence fell over the prisoners. Not fear, not awe, a quiet unraveling. They began to wonder, had they been lied to? Had they fought, killed, and bled for a story? But the fatal blow to Nazi ideology wouldn't come from machines. It would come from something far more dangerous: books and movie reels. Shattered illusions. War is more than bullets. By now, the prisoners were no longer just confused. They were unsettled. The bread had nourished their bodies. The machines had shattered their pride. But it was books, films, and silence that began to break something deeper: their beliefs. Inside the camp, small changes went unnoticed at first. A German sergeant, once a proud voice of Aryan supremacy, now sat in the corner of the library tracing the pages of an English-language primer. A former Nazi youth officer began asking questions about democracy, about Roosevelt, about how a nation could fight fascism and still feed its enemies. The Americans had opened a new front, not with rifles, but with ideas. In barracks-turned classrooms, POWs were invited, never forced, to attend lectures on American history, the Constitution, and individual freedom. Some scoffed. Others stayed out of curiosity. A few took notes. And over time, that curiosity became hunger. They read newspapers, New York Times, Stars and Stripes, even small-town publications. They saw headlines criticizing their own government, and even America's. This was new. This was dangerous. For in Nazi Germany, the press was perfect, or else it disappeared. And then came the films. Inside makeshift theaters, POWs were shown American classics, sometimes as part of re-education, other times as simple entertainment. But to many, it felt like a mirror held to their soul. They watched The Grapes of Wrath and wept, because this was not propaganda. This was self-critique, a story of poor Americans suffering, of injustice in a democratic nation, and yet told without shame, without censorship, with courage. One POW later wrote in his journal, "The Germans only ever showed perfection. The Americans showed truth, even when it made them look weak. That is a different kind of strength." For men raised in a system that punished questions, this new world that welcomed them was intoxicating. They had believed that America was a land of decadence, disorder, and decay. But now they saw, perhaps for the first time, a nation built not on racial hierarchy, but on resilience, self-examination, and second chances. It was not just America that wasn't weak. It was Nazism that wasn't unique. That was the final betrayal, the one that stung the most. Because if America could be strong and moral and merciful, then maybe Hitler wasn't the only way forward. Maybe he wasn't the way at all. "I once believed Americans were lazy," one former soldier wrote, "but they built harbors, fed prisoners, and educated enemies, as if we were friends." When the war ended, the men who returned to Germany were no longer the men who had left it. First drops on scorched earth. When the war ended, Germany was not just defeated, it was devastated. Cities lay in ruin, industry reduced to ash, and the ideology that had once united millions was exposed as a lie. And then the prisoners came home. Between 1945 and 1946, over 400,000 German POWs were repatriated from American camps. They stepped off ships and trains, not as returning heroes, but as survivors of a different kind of battle, a battle of ideas. These men had not just been held. They had watched, listened, read, worked, and perhaps most importantly, changed. They returned not only with stories of food and fairness, but with something rare in a broken nation: perspective. Many brought with them a quiet but powerful confidence, not in authoritarian control, but in organization, efficiency, education, and dignity. They had seen democracy in motion, not in theory, but in kitchens, workshops, libraries, and film reels, and they brought it back with them. Some became educators, building schools in towns where knowledge had once been censored. Others entered politics, helping to shape the democratic institutions of a newly forming West Germany. Many applied what they had learned in industry, introducing American-style efficiency, mass production, quality control, and a new kind of labor ethic that valued cooperation over domination. From prison camps to parliaments, from kitchen duty to factory foreman, from foreign enemies to foundations of a peaceful republic, they became, in a sense, the first drops of rain falling on a scorched, ruined nation. They were seeds, one American officer wrote, planted in captivity by the enemy, but growing into hope for peace. Their memoirs, published years later, spoke not only of war, but of awakening, of discovering that power does not lie in flags, speeches, or guns, but in integrity, compassion, and truth. And though many of them remained quiet in public, their influence was profound. Because when a country needs to be rebuilt, not just in bricks but in spirit, it takes more than money. It takes transformed minds. These POWs became the bridge generation, connecting a past soaked in violence to a future built on dialogue. But the greatest question still lingers. How could those once branded as enemies become something far more powerful, friends? From ideological darkness to a humanitarian dawn, it began with uniforms and iron hearts. Men who marched under swastikas, who believed in bloodlines and destiny, who saw the world through the barrel of a gun. And yet, by the time they left America, they carried no banners, no hatred, no certainty, only questions. The journey of the German POWs was never just from one country to another. It was from conviction to confusion, from shock to surrender, from prisoner to person. In 1985, 4 decades after the war, a reunion took place. Not in Germany, but in Texas. The guests of honor? Former Nazi soldiers. But they didn't arrive in chains. They came as friends to visit the American families who had once guarded them. They brought photographs, letters, and tears. Some had named their children after American guards. Others had kept the books they read in camp, the Bibles they were gifted, or the letters they'd written but never sent. One man held his former prison warden by the shoulders, looked into his eyes, and said, "You didn't just feed me, you saved me from myself, from what I had believed." These were not small stories. They were tectonic shifts, proof that humanity, when allowed to breathe, could grow through concrete. And so we ask, what if the Americans had treated their enemies with cruelty? What if they had returned hate with hate? What would those 400,000 men have brought back to a fragile, broken Germany? Would they have rebuilt or revenged? Instead, they returned with tools, ideas, respect, and the seeds of a new Germany that would help anchor peace in Europe for generations. And for us, decades later, what does this say about war, about mercy, about power? Perhaps it reminds us that how you treat your enemies reveals more about you than about them. In the end, the Allied victory wasn't just about air raids or code breaking. It was also won in the quiet acts of kindness, of books shared, of meals served, of ideas freely offered. But is that really the whole story? Or did America win a world war with a weapon no superpower ever saw coming? Compassion.